Hello to Europe and good evening to Asia. Well, very warm welcome to Asia Talk number 3 in season 4 already. Today we are going for a recap of the G20 meeting, as you've all seen on the invitation of the G20 meeting in Bali that had taken place recently. Was it another summit of bickering amongst the so-called great powers, or what can we read between the lines? Was there even more to it? We are going to discuss this with two great experts on the floor that are joining me today. Warm welcome to Shada, who is based in Brussels as a European specialist, analyst, think tanker, and a former journalist, which is also very important to everybody who is tuning in. She was with the Far Eastern Economic Review as a journalist for decades. So her special interest is, of course, still Asia, but she has an expertise also in Africa, geopolitics, trade, migration, inclusion, diversity, and all that, and her own think tank, New Horizons in Brussels. Thanks a lot for taking your time, Shada, to tune in today. And also a warm welcome to Sophie Siaref. She is currently based in London, a long-term journalist and anchor with Compass Television in Jakarta, and also a contributor to think tanks in Singapore and Germany, as well as being still an independent journalist, where she is pursuing her studies in London and going for her PhD on the new media. Floor will first be open to Shada. Well, you are very keen into the region, Shada, for analysts, and the global developments haven't turned for the better since mid-November. Of course not. Nobody, I guess, expected that. However, wishful thinking is always allowed, I guess. You have written an article in the EU Observer where you said the G20 meeting, despite especially played out in the Western media of saying, yeah, it was one of those meetings we always had, and Xi Jinping and Joe Biden shaking hands, great group pictures. Do we underestimate the region's strength? So not only the Indonesian president of having given a great performance, soft power, great diplomacy approach, but was there more behind the curtains, what we didn't see, or what might come out of the meeting? Floor is open to you, Shada.
Thank you very much, Martina. Hello, Sophie. Thank you very much for inviting me for this talk. It's a very, very important topic, and I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to be here. Let me just say that I'm not surprised that Western mainstream media or Western mainstream think tanks have underestimated the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, and of course, Indonesia as well. As you said, I've been working on Europe-Asia relations for almost 3 decades now, and I've always seen this happen. Very few people here actually understand the importance of what's actually happening in Asia, and they tend to overlook many, I would say, bigger picture stories, but also the details, and I'm sure Sophie will give us some indication of that. Before I talk to you a little bit about the G20 and ASEAN and why I think this meeting did provide a glimmer of hope in a very troubled geopolitical world, a glimmer of hope and a glimmer of an outline of what the world can be like when we move away from this toxic great power competition and look at how we can actually work together on some very, very important global challenges like climate change, like eliminating poverty, like dealing with the pandemic. So let me just provide my view on the geopolitical landscape as we see it today, and why I think the G20 format is well suited to deal with some of the global governance challenges that we face today. So obviously, Martina, we live in very perilous times, and the perilous times are not just the war in Europe, Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, but also the fact that the pandemic has slowed down our economies, and we're headed for what many are calling a winter of discontent in Europe, but across the world as well, I would say. So we're not just dangerous times because of the war, but I would sketch out for you some other reasons for reflection, I would say. So we're living in a world of very rapid change. Sophie's working on new media. That's one manifestation of rapid change. But change, whether it's ideas, whether it's change in power structures, brings friction, confrontation, and complexities. It also brings uncertainty. So we're living in an uncertain world where powers of the past, or I would say established powers, are finding themselves dealing with a very assertive and self-confident global South. So the global West, if you could call it that, you know, the United States, Europe, and the Asian powers like Japan and Korea, which are aligned with Australia and New Zealand, this global West is finding itself dealing with a very self-confident global South, which was not the case even a few years ago. You've got obviously US-China competition, which is weighing heavy on our landscape, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or whether it's in Europe. The issues of diversity and inclusion are not just for us in our personal lives, they're also becoming very, very important in geopolitics. We've had Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter is also, once again, not just about racial diversity when it comes to personal interactions, it's also about geopolitics and actually respect for the global South. So we've had questions of colonialism coming into our conversation, decolonization. At the recent COP27, we saw the loss and damage fund finally agreed after years and years of discussion, and that was largely because the global South, Pakistan, helped also by China, push that agenda. So dealing with inequalities, whether they're gender inequalities or racial inequalities or power inequalities, is very much on our agenda. And it's not just about hard power, but also about soft power, smart power, digital power. And it's not just about great power competition, as you talked about, it's also about small and middle-sized power. So we live really in a multipolar world. And, you know, I know I've had discussions with quite a few, I would say, older white think tankers and journalists who deny that it's a multipolar world. They still see the world as between, you know, the West, dominant West, and then the others are just marginal players. But I believe very much that countries across the world in the global South now have agency and have the confidence to push for their own concerns and their interests. And we're seeing this over the Russian war in Ukraine. Not all of them have chosen to align themselves with the Western American and European stance on Russia. They do not like what's happening. They are horrified by the war. They want an end to the war, but they're also not visibly and loudly condemning Russia as the West would like. Of course, Bali was interesting because President Jokowi, I'm going to call him that, managed to bring through his diplomacy these countries onto a single declaration, which was really the loudest public condemnation we've had, much louder than we've had in the United Nations, of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So G20 for me fits the bill of this multipolar, multi-power world. And I believe that G7, and I've written about it and got into some kind of criticism for it, but I believe G7 is a relic of the past. 7 industrial countries cannot deal with this changing, as I said, rapidly transforming world. And so this is the right format. And why this meeting in Bali was especially important, I think, is because of the landscape that I sketched out for you, but also because it was taking place in the Indo-Pacific, led by a country which is a very important member of the Indo-Pacific. And we know that Indo-Pacific is the geopolitical buzzword at the moment. Anyone wants to be there. It's about trade, connectivity, maritime security, or what have you. So Indo-Pacific, very important. ASEAN is also, and we will talk about that, I hope, becoming increasingly respected, I would say. I lived in a period where ASEAN was totally underestimated, and I would say ridiculed by some of our think tankers as just being a talk shop and a paper tiger. But we're seeing that, you know, behind that talk shop and paper tiger, there is a resilience and a strength, which is perhaps not hard power, but it is a self-confident strength that is important. We've seen in action Indonesia's soft power, the non-aligned policy of Jokowi, playing in. And I think the reason that there was this conciliatory tone and content at the Bali meeting was because Jokowi, through his patient, modest diplomacy, persistent diplomacy, managed to bring tempers down, to lower the temperature in the room. And he, I think, engineered very well this meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, which, by the way, went on for 3 hours. It was not just a photo opportunity, and which provided a glimmer of hope because it talked about not sliding into a new Cold War. It talked about responsible competition, not reckless confrontation. And I think that is a moment of confidence that we should have, and we should encourage that.
Shada, could I just interrupt? Sorry for doing that.
No, sure.
But as you said, you know, isn't it also because Xi Jinping at the moment feels, despite all the problems back home, very much insured now because he has got the backing for the next 5 to 10 years being in charge and being in office. Do you think that he was just so confident to be more approachable? Or was it really meant by him, which is always difficult to read?
Well, I mean, Martina, I would love to be sitting there in his head and know exactly what he was thinking. But the fact of the matter is that he came to Bali very confident, and actually so did Joe Biden, because Joe Biden had not had that defeat. The Democrats had not had that absolutely devastating defeat in elections that we had all been predicting. So both of them were confident. Xi Jinping, however, you may remember, went back to riots in the streets and protests in the streets over COVID-19. So however self-confident and however assured a leader is, uncertainty and unpredictability are part of our lives. So he may have been strong. I think both Biden was strong as well. And I think Jacoby was strong as well, because he also, I think, engineered this very, very well. So just to say that some of the elements, to come back to the G20 for a minute, I think one of the things we've learned is that diplomacy still matters. So in a multipolar world where everybody's talking about zero-sum games and, you know, us and them, and it's devastation around the corner if things turn out badly, diplomacy is still important. And I think Jokowi, Indonesia, and the G20, with all their varying sort of differences, I think illustrated the importance of diplomacy. And I think that's a lesson for all of us in the so-called global West to learn. It's not just about who shouts loudest. It's not just about who criticizes and calls people's names. It's also about how you work behind the scenes in this multipolar world. And it also taught us that binary choices, something that ASEAN has been saying for very long, so have the Europeans, by the way, don't squeeze us between the US and China. Let us make our own choices. We have our interests. They align with America on some points. They align with China on some points, including climate change and sustainable development goals. So I think that was important. And just to come back to the EU, because I'm based in Brussels and I keep a close watch on what the EU is doing. In a couple of days, actually, 10 days, we have the EU-ASEAN commemorative summit, 45 years of relationship between EU and ASEAN. And I think this is very important that even in this sort of dangerous war moment, Europeans are engaging so visibly and in such, I would say, public approach with the ASEAN countries. So I think a number of the 27 countries leaders will be here. And I think that's quite remarkable, actually. ASEAN has a strategic partnership now with the EU. But of course, the competition in the region is enormous. We've talked about AUKUS, Australia, UK, US trilateral military alliance. There's the Quad, which is 4 countries also in a military alliance, and the EU and ASEAN are not part of that, of these structures. So competition is high. You have RCEP, this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. You've got TTPP, which is being led by Japan. You have the American IFEP, which is the new idea that Biden has come up with. So the EU needs to up its game in the region in terms of connectivity partnerships, but also in terms of trade. And so here I'm hoping, and I'm going to end with this note, that we will at this summit have something important in terms of laying the groundwork for an EU-ASEAN free trade agreement. It won't happen overnight, but we can lay the groundwork by agreeing to start off discussions on partnerships on digital and on green renewable energy, and on digital partnerships. The EU has these partnerships with other countries in the region, including Japan and Korea, and I think that's important. Now, the future of, and one more thing that we can do is to revive our agreement to end our negotiations with Indonesia on an FTA, and to revive our free trade agreement negotiations with Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. And my final point on G20 is now the presidency is in the hands of the Indians. Does India have that kind of diplomatic credentials that Indonesia had as a power that was not engaged in alliances, etc.? Does Modi have the profile, or is he, I think, more of a polarizing figure than Jokowi is? It's a big country, India. Its neighborhood is not always at peace with India. There are quite a few friction between India and its neighbors. ASEAN is a, let's say, fairly united bloc behind Jokowi. So I'm just wondering if G20 will remain as powerful and with India in the chair. I hope it is. And I think Indian diplomats are very, very good, and they should ensure that the momentum that we reached in Bali on the G20 continues into the 2023. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this quick, overwhelming insight. I have to say, you were talking a lot about respect. I'll come back to that later again. Sophie, despite you being in London a little bit apart from daily political reporting, which is for sure very good for today, how was the G20 scene in Indonesia, and how was it covered in Indonesia? Those are two different questions. And what is your opinion? Are you as optimistic as Shada, or you're a little bit more critical with your own government? Who knows?
Okay, thank you. It was really nice to be in the same event as you, Shada. Thank you, Martina, for inviting me. The way Shada actually lay out the land, it might make me sound like a bit, you know, disgruntled dissident away from my country. But yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say that whatever Shada was talking about regarding partnership between the EU or basically European countries or basically Western countries with Indonesia in specific or with ASEAN or the global South in general, I totally agree with that. There has to be a shift in mindset regarding how the global North is actually, you know, cooperating, having a real, true, significant relationship with the global South, especially those in ASEAN. The backward thinking of you know, thinking that the center of the universe is in Western, and then the global South would be just like a subaltern kind of domination. It needs to change because in a way, regarding the future crisis that we are seeing, especially on climate change, etc., it needs a significant global cooperation, and the global South are going to be the ones that are dealing with the most effects. So I was actually I was really excited when Shada pushed the agenda of true partnership between the Western countries, more specifically European Union, and those of us in Asia. Regarding the G20 as well, as a global event, I would have to say, I would have to send my highest respect because in a way it was successful. You understand that the whole geopolitical crisis that has been looming regarding the invasion of Russia towards Ukraine. We also, especially as an Indonesian, I was so, you know, a bit anxious regarding of whether or not the leaders will come after Jokowi extended the invitation both to Putin and Zelensky. But overall, it was a success. But however, seeing that Indonesia, okay, so I will basically paint a picture here. A few months ago, there was a research done by Lowy Institute. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Lowy Institute, saying that the majority of Indonesia considers foreign policy merely as a means to achieve domestic interests. So in a way, I would put it a bit brash, but it was some kind of an inward thinking of Indonesians, and that definitely is being reflected by the whole government. So there was a huge criticism, although there was a lot of appreciation, but there was also a huge criticism when Jokowi actually made it to Russia and to meet Putin, and then he made it to Ukraine to meet Zelensky. We thought that it was going to be a very strategical thing. We thought that the government had a significant, foreign policy strategy to basically follow up those meetings, especially because afterwards, not long afterwards, we have the G20. But unfortunately, I think I'm going to quote Aaron Connolly from IISS here. He was basically saying, is it for the gram or is it for something more significant in terms of the global public good? I would say that it's more the former rather than the latter. Although Jokowi's foreign policy approach might actually, put out a lot of advances in terms of not siding with any particular geopolitical power in the world, but I think it's not something that is orchestrated and more of a thing that is just basically like the unintended effect of his choices of global foreign policy. So in terms of the G20 itself, I would say that our hosting capability was good. The idea that Indonesia can actually host a global event is there, but I would like to see more proofs from the current government regarding the substantive foreign policy after the whole G20 carnival, because we tend to treat it that way. I would love to see an actual foreign policy that is impactful. Shada was also saying about ASEAN. I think ASEAN would be a really good proving ground, a ground to prove their points, because currently the whole ASEAN, this is a bit maddening for me, because as part of the ASEAN country, we don't actually say anything about the horrendous thing that is happening in Myanmar, while we are actually the ones that has to be, loudly speaking about it. We have the means, we have the, we are a part of ASEAN. Myanmar is part of ASEAN. So in a way that some commentators might see Indonesian global policy as being good in terms of it not being, siding with any particular access of power in the world. But I would say that we need more substantial, we need more significant foreign policy that, that just not going with the narrative of, oh, we've tried. Just like, how when Jokowi was coming to Russia and as well as Ukraine, oh, we've tried. But, being neutral, sometimes posing the risk that you are actually siding with the wrong kind of side. So we need to be careful about that. And the whole G20 as well, I think there's a bit difference between how it is being portrayed by the media and how it is being perceived by the Indonesian people. In the media, it is being portrayed as some sort of a global event that is important. A lot of meaningful talks, meaningful discussion can come out of that. But in Indonesia's public part, I think it's more being seen as merely an event. So if you look up to several local news throughout the G20, actually there were a lot of attempt to curtail protests, because the local government would under the rationale by the local government that it is something that is humiliating towards the national government. Like the idea that it is an international event. This is where Indonesia gets to show their public policy, and the people protesting was being perceived as a bit humiliating for the government. I think that's just like how we see overall foreign policy. And one thing for sure is that if you see the whole, exactly why I would use the word carnival, it was being treated that way. I think there's a deeper sense in that of why we were so serious in planning the whole G20 meetings, is that because we have the belief that successful G20 presidency will be able to boost investment in a way and accelerate the economic recovery or economic development. So I think there's a bit of unmatched of what the G20 is really is, and how the Indonesian people and a lot of Indonesian government officials is actually perceiving it.
Great, thanks a lot. Shada, I could tell you were already nervous responding to Sophie. Let me just go for one question, Sophie. How is Indonesia's foreign policy perceived amongst the neighboring countries?
Well, if you see how, I think in a way, several other countries. Last June, I was attending this summit, defense summit, that was in Singapore, and our defense minister Prabowo Subianto was saying something about the ASEAN way of peace. So basically, he was saying that in this case, the Western, your idea of garnering peace might be different to our idea of garnering peace. What he was trying to say is that by being, having 1,000 friends and 0 foes, that's our idea of peace. That's our idea of maintaining and garnering peace. While, on the more basic side of it is actually probably being represented as saying nothing in front of any particular humanitarian crisis, most probably. I would definitely, I won't say anything about Ukraine, but I would definitely put a highlight on what was happening in Myanmar. The fact that ASEAN countries did not put any specific or any strong statements regarding what was happening in Myanmar. I think a lot of neighboring countries of Indonesia is actually seeing that, oh, that kind of political foreign policy approach might be good in the long term in terms of economical gain, right? But so the fact that ASEAN was a bit muted in terms of how they deal with Myanmar, I think it speaks a volume regarding how a lot of Asian countries is actually using the Indonesian playbook in this part. I would like to say that sometimes I think that the idea that you can separate between geopolitics from geoeconomics, I think it's a bit naive, but yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Just a few sentences about it. Do you think, would Indonesia be accepted as the leading foreign policy power within ASEAN countries for the future or in the global south? Do you think it will be accepted? Is that the mission to go there? Or will you always be like, no, we are all equal and we try not, to touch sensitive issues with our neighboring countries?
So I think personally, it should be achievable. It should be feasible. I mean, in terms of the vastness of Indonesia alone, actually, if you play your card right, you can actually use we can actually use our economic, prowess in that term. But it definitely depends on the shift of point of view in the Indonesian government side regarding how important global policy, how important foreign policy is actually for Indonesia to take up that role as the leader in the global South. The fact that I think what is more profound currently is that Jokowi is nearing his end of term. We will have our election in 2024. So with a lot of sides within the domestic government is currently not being in a good place. I think Jokowi wants to secure that in order for him to make sure that his successor is going to be the next Indonesian president. So I think within the next 2 years, the concentration, the focus will not be on foreign policy. I have to say that it's a big, it's just, it needs actually, we can achieve that, but I don't think the Indonesian government is in the right place and in the right, framework to actually try to get into that point.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Shada, you look like as if you'd like to immediately respond to Sophie.
Not immediately. I was listening with great interest. Just maybe 4 or 5 points. I mean, I know Indonesia rather well. I have to say, I've spent a lot of time there working, and so it is a foreign country, but it's not really a very foreign country. So I know it very well, and I know that the shift from SBY, the former president, to Jokowi was quite an important shift in terms of local politics, but also public image, because Jokowi came in focusing very much on domestic and ASEAN. And Ibu Retno, the foreign minister, has also looked so far inwards and ASEAN region-wide. That's what she said. And I think for us, watching the Global South and ASEAN, I think it was quite refreshing to see Jokowi taking a more visible stance on G20 and traveling. And in fact, some of us here in the Global West were rather happy that there was this attempt, and very serious attempt, being made by the Indonesian leader to get a conciliatory G20 and not an abrasive one, because I think the Americans and the Europeans were ready for a real clash and were ready to walk out if Vladimir Putin had been at the meeting. And all of that did not happen. And I do give credit to Indonesian diplomats for having achieved that. Now, all leaders across the world put domestic interests first, because elections matter, and even in autocratic regimes, domestic interests come first. So that's not a surprise to me that a foreign policy stance is colored or influenced by domestic interests. For instance, if the G20 provides a good image for Indonesia as an investment destination, well, hello, I'm very happy about that, because I think it is time that people started paying attention to Indonesia's economic prospects and assets. Indonesia, when it takes over the ASEAN chairmanship as of 2023, they're in the chair, I think that gives them also continuing, if you like, global regional stature. So the G20 presidency finishes and the ASEAN presidency begins, so almost at the same time. And that's where I think, looking at Indonesia today, and of course, Myanmar has been an awful blight on ASEAN's reputation. It's an awful blight, I have to say, on the world's reputation. Because of course, ASEAN has a big role to play, and Muslim countries across the world have a big role to play, but it's all of our responsibility not to allow that to deteriorate further. And I think ASEAN, I think Jokowi is under pressure from domestic and regional activists, human rights activists, to do something more about it than just issuing statements and declarations. So I do expect some kind of a reaction from the Indonesians on Myanmar when they are in the chair. That's what the impression I have is. And finally, for us, we live in a 27-nation European Union, and we've always looked at Germany Germany and France as our locomotives. That's changing now with 27 countries, of course, and the fact that we have Eastern Central European countries, big ones, also members. But I believe that in my view of the region, ASEAN's role is really determined by Indonesia's reputation. Singapore, of course, is a leading intellectual hub, but Indonesia definitely as well. And now we have Anwar in Malaysia. We have Marcos in the Philippines, and we'll have a transition also, of course, in Indonesia. So we have new leaders coming in as well. And I think that the region itself is going to become even more prominent than it is at the moment. That's my outlook. But maybe I am overly optimistic, but I sincerely believe that this is ASEAN's moment. And if it fails to grab the moment, then it really is doing itself a disservice.
You were saying it's ASEAN's moment. So what is EU's moment towards ASEAN by now? Because, you know, it's on trade, it's strategic, but are we really into it in Europe? Are the European countries not only, you know, like looking over the table and I mean, yeah, we are host to it, but do we really respect them?
I think
not
we
only
are
in terms of economics.
I think we're beginning to respect other countries, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's India. We're beginning to deal with countries in a different way than we did before. I mean, recently we had the High Representative of the EU, Josep Borrell, talking of the world in very derogatory terms, the European garden and the jungle outside, right? I don't think that's reflective. I think that was, I mean, that was really colonial mindset. And okay, maybe it's his age, maybe he made a mistake, whatever it was, but you know, it created an uproar. And I've spoken to a lot of European diplomats who are actually stationed in Asia, and there is growing recognition that Europe can't manage this world. The G7 can't manage this world on its own. It needs the agency, the power, the assistance, the coalescing with the global South. Whether that's actually done in practice immediately or not, because, you know, Bettina, old habits die hard. The old habits of, you know, where the rule makers and the rest are the rule takers dies very hard. And they see China as a huge competition, which of course it is, but other countries are there as well. I mean, the BRICS, for instance, ASEAN coming up as well. So the global West will have to deal with a very complex world where their word is not decree. You know, where they will have to build alliances, where they have to build partnerships and friendships. And that means respect, because if you don't go there with respect, you don't get nothing in return, babe.
Yeah, respect and self-confidence was another word both of you used, or expression. Do you think that European countries are really self-confident enough and utterly prepared and educated, I'd like to say, it's a provocative, I know, to really deal with this and this challenge? It's not only an opportunity in my view, but it's also a challenge.
So for me, we are not prepared.
And yeah.
We are not prepared. I mean, we are clinging, and we are clinging to the G7, as you know, we're clinging to NATO, we're clinging to America's coattails. We don't know if Biden will be replaced by another Democrat, or whether we'll have another Trump or one of his acolytes in power. I think we made a lot of headway as Europeans under Donald Trump, because we realized we have to stand on our own. And Angela Merkel said that, you know, we have to, you know, turn to ourselves. So we made a lot of headway in terms of thinking about autonomy and strategic autonomy, defense, and the rest of it. Now we're backsliding again because of the war, Russia's horrible war in Ukraine. We're backsliding into extreme, I would say, reliance on the United States for military help for Ukraine, but also to buy LNG, to give us succor, to give aid. And the question now, and I'll end here, the question now on our agenda is the dependencies. So we were dependent on Russia for our energy, which led to a lot of mistakes and errors in terms of determining our energetic future. We're now having to sort of shift and change, and we became reliant on China for exports and imports, for investments, for our cheap consumer goods and our technology as well, sharing of technology. So are we learning to respect the rest of the world? We're learning very hard that if we don't respect the rest of the world, we're going to pay a very high price.
Sophie, anything?
I totally agree with that. I mean, but this is why there's a saying that the grass is always greener. I am always more optimistic about the European Union compared to Shada. And Shada is always more optimistic about the global South compared to myself. But yeah, the idea that that there has to be a shift in power balance, not shift in power. It's just like, shift just to make sure that the power is balanced is I think important, because it shows a lot about the hypocrisy. I'm so sorry to use this word on the Western countries, that especially if we talk about climate change, the global South is going to be the first countries that will have the massive impact of climate crisis. Like, you have to just say that as a fact. But the whole idea of curtailing this kind of climate change is using the Western kind of framework, in which basically curtailing all industries altogether, while the global South hasn't actually enjoy the development of industrialization such as the Western countries. So there's a bit of it's not fair. It's just not fair. And I was hoping that actually this kind of discussion was going to come about.
We lost you a bit, Sophie.
20, but probably it's going to take more than just one. But okay, am I already connected now, Martina?
Now you are better, much better.
Okay.
Could you just repeat your last 2-3 sentences, please?
Sorry, okay. So basically, probably I was hoping that the whole idea of balancing, probably it wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be, and it might need a few more meetings for that. But yeah, I totally agree with how Shada was actually portraying the whole relation between the Western countries and, in this case, ASEAN or Asian countries. But I am going to just like come back to the idea of Indonesia being a major power play within the global South. Because I totally see that happening. It is my hope that the Indonesian people, the Indonesian public, the Indonesian government, the next government will see this differently as well. One thing I was hoping to change is that President Jokowi, his own stance regarding the foreign policy. If you see the G20 meetings, if you see how he actually went to Ukraine and Russia, it was very endearing. It was very, it cast a lot of hope. But then you remember that, in ASEAN, we didn't have any particular stance in regards to defending Myanmar, or that Jokowi has not once attended the UNGA. Of all his 8 years in power, he has never attended the UNGA, even though some might think that it's useless. But I personally think that it's just a global framework. It's a global platform for you to actually put out the ideas, what ideas of foreign policy Indonesia has that can, domestically put forward their interests, but putting Indonesia in the global map as well. So I would love to see that changing in 2 years' time, because I think in the next year, because Jokowi still has like 1.5 years of presidency of power. I hope that to change, and if the ASEAN countries especially can see this change in Jokowi, it might shift the whole narratives within the ASEAN countries as well into, gaining more confidence within the ASEAN countries to actually put out a substantial foreign policy of our own. I think I'm looking forward for that.
Shada, do you think this is already a pathway for the meeting on the 14th or 16th December in Brussels? To say, commemorative meeting, strategic ASEAN meeting, do you think there will already be a kind of orientation towards that?
Towards a future partnership, which is slightly more strategic?
Yeah, and more the Indonesia taking a little bit leadership kind of position in ASEAN?
Well, I mean, as I said, ASEAN chairmanship will be in the hands of Indonesia next year. So this is going to be, they're going to take the lead in terms of Myanmar, I've been told. Yeah. And also we're hoping that we'll get a trade agreement finally with Indonesia, EU-Indonesia. There are huge obstacles there, of course, and they have to do with environmental protectionism on the part of the EU, on palm oil imports from Indonesia, on forestry products, on fishery products. So there's a whole line of contentious issues where Indonesia, I think justifiably in many cases, claims that the EU is protecting vested interests rather than working for a real green transition. So that's going to be important. You know, the thing is that, can you imagine, I mean, 45 years of relationship, but this is the first time that EU27 are meeting 10 ASEAN countries in together, you know, so they've been meeting in within the ASEM framework, Asia-Europe meetings, they've been meeting at the UNGA, etc. But this is important. And don't forget that Joe Biden has had his summit with the ASEAN, and the Chinese leaders often have the summit with ASEAN. So we're really lagging behind. And it's taken us a long time because, look, 27 countries have very different foreign policy, security interests, right? Indonesia and ASEAN are very important to our Western European members of the EU, less so, much less so to the Eastern and Central European members. They're less interested in the Indo-Pacific. They're more interested in what's happening in their region. The Southern countries are more interested in what's happening in the Mediterranean region. So we've got these very fragmented foreign policy priorities in the EU, but Indo-Pacific is extremely important for Germany, for France, for the Netherlands, for Belgium, and for the EU collectively through Brussels, and Poland. But I don't see other countries in the world in the EU, sorry, taking that same kind of passionate interest, or because they don't have direct business links, you know. So it's all about that. But respect, there's growing respect. Because they're being forced to respect countries outside the European Union. They're being forced to respect the global South because we need the global South.
But still, if I read in between or hear in between the lines, you say you have some doubts that there will be amongst the EU27 a more joint foreign policy approach towards the Indo-Pacific.
Difficult to have. And there will be, I hope there will not be a big fight over Russia and Ukraine and how strongly to condemn Russia, because as you know, many of our Central and Eastern European countries and Baltics want a very strong condemnation of Russia. As we saw at the G20 and at the General Assembly, not many ASEAN countries are ready to play ball when it comes to that. There is a bottom line. And I hope there's clever diplomacy to ensure that that doesn't become this unseemly diplomatic quarrel, which dominates the summit.
Which country in between the Euro member states do you see could take the lead in this question?
If I were to tell you the truth, I think France, Germany are the two countries that can have real diplomatic heft within the EU. And of course, the External Action Service should do its job as well, the European External Action Service. That's what they were set up for.
Yeah, always hoping for the best. Years and well wishes, I'd rather call that a little bit. You briefly touched the TPPP and the RCEP. And of course, Europe likes to look a little bit more to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, a little bit like-minded, like where they seem to feel a little bit more comfortable with in dealing. Do you think that like Japan is, squeezed into the problematic region at the moment, China as its neighbor and bad military forces, and then the Taiwan question, do you think Europe will take a position on that, or are we too scared? Are we always looking to economics and that's it?
Too scared of China, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how would who's scared of China, and who would, like Japan or Korea, get a little bit more closer to Europe for advice?
Yeah, so
Or-
Europe has, as you said, Europe has very good relations with Japan, but do not forget, I do not forget that some decades ago, Japan was the competitor, right? It was,
Yes.
excuse the term, the real competition, the real rival for both the United States and for Europe. I mean, I was a journalist then and writing about that. So a lot of what's happening now with China, when we talk about competition, rivalry with China, has echoes for me of the way we were dealing also with Japan. With Korea, it was very, very similar as well in the beginning, right? So it takes time for the global West to recognize that competitors are emerging from the global South. We don't have any yet of that same significance from South America or from Africa. So it will take time. The question of China is going to be the biggest challenge for the European Union foreign policy. We know, and we've talked about it, 27 countries in the EU, each with their own interests, each with, you know, Sophie, you were talking about Indonesia playing the foreign policy because of domestic interests. We've seen that happen in the EU all the time. You know, the smallest countries take the strongest stance on issues like Taiwan because they have very little at stake when it comes to relations with Taiwan. The larger countries like Germany and France do not take positions that are too extremist because they know there's going to be retaliatory action from China or from other countries, by the way. So this is going to be, and I think deserves a special session on European policy towards China. Will it tilt towards the United States? Or will it actually be autonomous, independent? I think is the biggest question on our agenda at the moment. Can we break away from America's coattails and develop our own strategy towards China? I hope we can. I think it's going to really make a difference to our own future as Europe if we can do this, if we can do so. Stand alone outside America's shadow.
Oh, that could be a takeaway of today's session, but I have one question in mind that doesn't relate to our hard political talk today. We briefly touched it beforehand. We were talking about foreign policy, and our German foreign minister just currently being to India and trying to leave a footprint over there and touring and seeking alliances. To solve the question of war and, of course, repair a little bit the economic damage that is caused naturally by the war. You were talking about respect, equality of power, inclusion, geopolitics. Does a different approach in foreign policy, and I'm now a bit blunt, a more female feminism foreign policy would help to approach the goals you have just stated, both of you, quicker? Sophie, you go first.
Okay, so I just want to touch back a bit of what Shada was saying. So basically, yes, I totally agree with you. It's either the ones who have enough power or the ones who have nothing to lose, who are basically having the audacity to put out very, very strong statements or probably condemnation in this case. But I think this is what I want to see within my own country as well. That is what you said, Shada, clever diplomacy. Indonesia, in Indonesia's case, we're not there yet, but we're not here as well. So we're in somewhere in somewhere between being very powerful or being very, we don't have anything to lose, but we're not both of these poles. So clever diplomacy, I would really want that to happen. I have a huge respect towards our current foreign minister, Ibu Retno Marsudi. She is a very clever, she's very bright, even though she's very low profile, very, you don't hear her talk a lot, but I definitely think that she has what Shada called as clever diplomacy as well. And this kind of diplomacy might probably be seen in probably female figures as well. But I think it also, it's not about the female figures in global diplomacy that is the main problem here. The main problem is like the whole global diplomacy men probably are they going to listen to this clever diplomacy that is being put forward by female politicians or not? Or in my case, is the voice of a foreign minister who is a woman named Retno Marsudi is going to be listened by her own president or not? So I think there's a chance of a very clever diplomacy in the near future. It relates, with a lot of female politicians as well, and I would love to see that kind of level of diplomacy being put into play. But again, clever diplomacy won't be clever so long as leaders of the world are not listening to this kind of, approach or diplomacy that is being put forward.
Shada.
I'm very skeptical of, I'll be very blunt, I'm very skeptical of feminist foreign policy. I think we need feminist geopolitics. We need an inclusive geopolitics. That's what I talked about in the beginning. And bringing, so far, the feminist foreign policy experts that I've talked to, put the focus on representation. So you need more women here, you need more women there. What is less obvious for me is when these women are there, what are they doing? Are they going to repeat, as Sophie was saying, are they going to repeat what the men are saying, but just do it, differently? The table is patriarchal. Are they going to be able to restructure the table, restructure the conversation? And what has been very disappointing for me, it's all about, there's very little focus on intersectionality. So the fact that women, race, poverty, disabilities, all of those intersect, and it's very much dominated, I'm sorry to be so blunt about it once again, by white women. White women, for me, if they're coming with the same background as their male counterparts, are not changing the dynamic. So far, I haven't seen it. I'd be very happy to see it. For me, feminist geopolitics is about changing the root causes of conflicts, understanding them, working behind the scenes, working in front of the scenes, actually working to prevent wars, actually working to prevent strife, bringing women into peace negotiations, and then giving them the voice and the power to actually speak up and make changes. So we're doing a lot of performance, at the moment in terms of female feminist foreign policy. We're not looking at the content, the substance, and what anchors us. And for me, it's inclusion and diversity that anchors us. We need to be empathetic, but the women I know in terms of foreign policy, I'm sorry, they're happy to be, I'm sorry, there are 11 defense ministers, women defense ministers in NATO. Have you seen any change in NATO's military conversations or military narratives? There are foreign ministers, women foreign ministers in meet, and they talk about Iran. What can they change unless they actually engage with the Iranian, at some point, leadership, or with Iranian civil society? So a lot of this for me is about publicity and visibility and narratives that for me don't ring true. I want inclusive geopolitics. And that if a woman like Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, comes forward and does something different, there I think she is making a difference.
Thank you. That was a really good takeaway. In two sentences, Sophie, your takeaway for 2023 of the Indonesian position here.
I think because there will be an election in 2024, and Jokowi has only 1.5 years in his, in power. I think this might probably be the time for him to take more risks, because I think he wants to put his name on the map as well, in terms of projects after his presidency is done, after he is not, the president any longer, and he needs that to basically prolong his own political life as well. So within the next year, I think, okay, so this is probably I think or I hope, somewhere in between that. that he is willing to take more risks in engaging in global diplomacy in a more strong position, just so that he might be able to put Indonesia's new foreign policy as one of his legacy. I think he needs that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of you. We already ran out of time. Thank you for everybody tuning in today on the recap of G20 Asia Talk number 3, season 4. Thank you for being with us. It was the last Asia Talk for this year. We resume on the 11th of January with agriculture, food security, and wishing you all, not only the panelists, thanks again a lot for taking the time, but also you, happy ending of the year, everybody staying healthy, and we are hoping that we will achieve in 2023 a more global balance. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in.